So we're delighted to be joined now by the founder and editor of Kent Current, my favourite local journalism outlet, Ed Jennings. Thank you for joining us, Ed. And we wanted to talk to you on the show this week because of an absolutely infuriating story. I think everyone who must have read it in your newsletter, certainly if you're abundance-pilled like we are, would have been absolutely raging. It's about a battery storage farm that's proven controversial in North Kent. So can you give us the gist? Why is this so enraging? What's happened here?
So it's one of those stories where a green energy company called Clearstone Energy proposed putting together a battery energy storage solution near Dartford in Kent. This would have been a £200 million development, providing 300 megawatts of energy, which I know doesn't sound very much in its own right, but it's enough to basically power the three neighbouring towns for an hour. And that's one small storage location. This is not a big storage location, ultimately. It's a tiny slip of land. And it reached this weird point where, as is often the case, particularly in Kent politics, planning officers at Dartford Borough Council proposed refusing permission to build the storage in the first place.
And it's particularly annoying because of where it is and stuff. So I know the area a little bit. I'm not a million miles away from this battery storage place. And I think one of the complaints was, and you mentioned it in your piece about it, was one of the criticisms was this was going to harm the, quote, rural character of the area. So can you tell us about the Garden of England and the rural character of where this battery farm was going to be imposed?
Right. Well, so this beautiful rural area was directly south to the A2, one of the main transport corridors through Kent, which, for those not familiar, is an 8-lane dual carriageway. This is not some minor country lane. Immediately north of the site is also the high-speed one rail link connecting Ebbsfleet to Ashford and the wider continent. To the south of it is another railway line. To the east of it is and this is where it does start to get really important, a garden centre car park, and a local council dump. So these are the things surrounding this beautiful patch of untarnished countryside that Dartford Borough Council was so eager to protect.
So what's actually happened? So the company have put in and said they want to build the battery storage there. Dartford Borough Council, they've not officially said no, I guess, but the thing was withdrawn because it looked like the votes were going to go against approving this project. So is that it? Are we not going to get any battery storage?
At this point, it's hard to know. So the official position is that the application has been withdrawn at the moment because Clearstone Energy very much saw the way the wind was blowing on this. And once the planning officers decided that they were going to recommend refusal, there was pretty much no chance councillors were going to go against the officers' recommendations. Councillors will often go against officers' recommendations to turn something down, but never to actually approve something. So yeah, once the writing was kind of on the wall for the application, they withdrew it. I imagine they probably will try and return again with a new version of the application in the future, but there's no way to know that at the moment.
And what's the kind of consequence of that for Kent, right? So essentially companies are trying to come to the county, they're trying to build things there. That's obviously going to help the local energy grid, but it's also jobs, it's construction, it's workforce and so on. Like, are these projects becoming more and more difficult in Kent, and what is the sort of potential impact of that?
Yeah, this is just kind of the latest in sort of a line of these kind of developments. We've had multiple solar farms across Kent rejected on very similar grounds to protect the rural character, often of which is not particularly rural sites. Often they can be what would be described as in this case, as what are now grey belt sites. So, peripherally on the fringe of the green belt, but not actually serving any green purpose. And so, yeah, we're seeing solar farms. I mean, we had a baffling example a few months ago where a green-led council in Kent fought to turn down a solar farm in Kent. So Kent is very big at talking the big game about switching to green energy, but they are not seemingly particularly eager if it actually means building anything to provide the green energy.
And how do they kind of justify that? So if you're a green councillor, you're turning down this project, which is pretty much vital if you want to have renewable energy. You need solar farms and you need batteries because you need to be able to store it and redistribute it and have energy when the sun isn't shining. So, I mean, do these councillors ever sort of give any explanation specifically about how this fits in with their wider aims?
It's one of those things where there's never really a coherent view on this. You will find every development will have its own very specialized reasons of why they don't want it. So in this particular case, there was an argument, for example, that the field was providing oxygen. So that's fantastic. Even though this is a very small patch of land, it's not publicly accessible. You can't actually go there and have enjoy this oxygen that it's generating. And more bafflingly in the officer's explanation was that it would cause an unnaturally flat development on the land. So flattening the countryside would look particularly unnatural, and therefore that would not be acceptable for the rural character. Now, this does vary across different areas. The green lead example from earlier, they were much more about just we can't build on agricultural land, which, is an argument, but also it's an argument we seem to use for every single bit of green energy infrastructure that comes along. So it's really hard to justify how you can ever get green energy built. If you can look at a plot of land like this and this isn't the place, where is?
So it's sort of reminiscent of places like Lincolnshire or Northumbria, where we've covered similar stories, right? Of particularly solar farms, wind farms, they're in development. Councils have often declared a climate emergency, and these proposals come forward and they reject them. They're unable to make any progress. And at some point, it's like, well, what was the point of declaring a climate emergency in the first place? You may as well be climate skeptics or something if you're going to do this, which provides a neat segue into my next question, which is that in a number of these places, those councillors have been swept aside by the reform juggernaut, as I think we're legally obliged to call it. This has obviously happened local to you. So how much of a vibe shift has that kind of caused there?
Well, the good news is that in Kent, we no longer have a climate emergency because since Reform swept power in the May local elections, among deciding on basically flag policy for County Hall, the only other thing they've meaningfully done at the council is to rescind the climate emergency in Kent. So thankfully, we don't need green energy because there is no climate emergency in Kent. So really, Dartford Borough Council are just getting on board with where we are as a county.
So what is this like? They give us a sense of like the reform have taken over the council. As you say, they seem to be spending a lot of the time fiddling with flags and making undeclarations of things. How are they governing in general? Are they actually doing substantial things, or is a lot of this kind of TikTok stuff for show, effectively?
Yeah, at the moment, there's been very little example of actual governing in Kent. What has happened has pretty much just been a continuation of the Conservative administration's policies from before May. Literally, the only new things Reform have seemingly come up with is rescinding the climate emergency and seemingly cutting a few bits from the budget, but nothing substantial. So hence why they're now panicking about having to increase council tax next year, because there is no real meaningful savings to be found in local government. They've swept into power on this promise that we are going to, save hundreds of millions of council waste, and discovered that doesn't really exist in the first place. So now they're seemingly begging the opposition for suggestions of what they can actually do to cut money from the council.
So, Ed, one of the reasons it's important what you're doing is you're at the front lines of watching reform when they're actually doing stuff in Kent. But in addition to Kent Current, you're also the brains behind Local Authority, which is a Medway-specific newsletter. Medway is in Kent, but it's also not in Kent. It's a unitary authority that declared its independence a little while ago. So it's a strange place by my standards. But the reason I want to mention it is because you published an amazing interview with a Medway-based reform councillor not so long ago, where I think he said he didn't read books. And the only policy view I got a sense of was that he doesn't want new housing. So is Kent screwed in terms of abundance aligned topics? We care about housing and energy. Should we just be preparing for endlessly depressing news for the next 5 years or something like that?
It's one of those slightly odd things, because if you actually look at like the National Reform Party policy, they're actually very enthusiastic about building housing, and accept there is a housing crisis and we do need to get on and build. The problem is, much like, I guess it's a similar situation amongst Labour, the Greens, and maybe some others, that the second you actually come to building new houses on their local patch, then it kind of all changes very rapidly. And there's always, again, a very good reason why not to build in their patch, but you should definitely go build in the other patch. I'm not quite as pessimistic about the state of Kent as you've maybe made it sound there in the question, James, which is slightly surprising given how many of these council meetings I'm sitting in and hearing these reform councillors. I think mostly because I don't believe many of them are actually doing anything. Most of the day-to-day work is all still done by council officers. That hasn't really changed.
It's the Kent deep state.
Your words, not mine, James. It's just that thing. It's that kind of like, councillors don't really do that much. They are there ultimately to guide policy rather than to actually do things. And yes, obviously there is like a perception, and there is an element of things they can control. But in terms of, say, building in Kent, not much has really changed since May. I mean, everything was effectively being NIMBY'd under the Tories just as much as it's now being NIMBY'd under Reform. So from our point of view, not much has changed, really.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing with a number of topics that we cover is, as you say, different parties come in, but the amount of change is not necessarily as much as you would think. Even when radical parties are coming in, say the Greens or say Reform, actually they seem to sort of come up against reality and the real world and the limitations of their power. And often behind the scenes, even though the vibes are very different, actually the same sort of NIMBYism or the same kind of concerns and things come into play. So, I mean, is it just the case that really whoever comes into power, actually the county kind of continues on and the impact is quite limited? Is there basically a limit to what reform could do in Kent?
Yeah, so fundamentally it does sort of feel that way. We're now 6 months into reform administration, and again, this could very much come back and haunt me a few years from now, but at the moment, things don't feel dramatically different. Most day-to-day functions of the council have kind of continued on. I mean, officers at the council that I've spoken to said that not much has changed on their day-to-day, other than maybe there's, a slightly different level of communication from councils involved. And I think that's the biggest part of the problem. When radical parties come in, it's often that you've got inexperienced councillors coming into the role, so they don't really know what they can and can't do anyway. So nearly everything they're sort of doing at that point is then guided by officers. And officers, as we know, are very much, they would rather keep kind of the status quo of the council kind of to moving on smoothly.
I thought it was really striking, Ed. A few weeks ago on Kent Current, you wrote about how you went down to Ashford for an event that the council were running, the reform-led council were running, to try and basically raise attention about cross-channel rail services, something we talked about on our show repeatedly, not least because I'm very self-interested in it because I live in Kent as well, and restarting services from Ashford and Ebbsfleet. And it seems almost like that was like normal politics. You had the Kent county council person there, you had like Labour MPs there, and you had all the sort of, I guess, civil society Kent types there. So it does seem like normal council things are happening anyway.
Yeah, I think when it comes to particularly an issue like the international rail services, where it's probably the only issue in Kent pretty much everyone agrees on, you will struggle to find anyone in Kent who doesn't want trains back at Ebbsfleet and Ashford. And that extends from Reform to Labour to the Lib Dems to Tories to anyone, basically. So in that context, yes, you can get everyone in the room and have a nice, sometimes literal song and dance about bringing trains back to Kent.
I'm sorry, I'd love to see this song and dance show. Where can we? Is there video of this? Like, where do we find the singing and dancing?
I mean, I do have about a minute of it, and there was literally singing and dancing. It was utterly horrifying.
Wow.
But no, so the problem is it doesn't necessarily work that way for every issue. We've got this agreement on international rail. I would say communication between councils in Kent feels a lot more strained now than it did previously. We're regularly seeing weird disputes between certainly Medway and Kent County Council now, just on, I think it is this thing again of inexperienced councillors and just business not being done in the way things used to be done previously. So you've now got there's a situation in the last week where two Kent tourism bodies collapsed. Kent County Council and Medway Council agreed to get them up and running again. One day before the agreement was signed, Kent County Council got in touch with Medway Council and were like, no, you now need to give us double the amount of money to get this off the ground than we originally agreed. And it's not that necessarily that amount of money is wrong. It's the fact of just they're not doing things by the sort of agreed standard. It's the last minute changes and just kind of from Medway's point of view, Kent are an increasingly unreliable partner, at least when it comes to politics. But yes, I don't think that really changes much on the day-to-day function of the council.
So Ed, you set up local authority to basically improve news reporting and by extension local democracy in Kent. I think part of that was based on your sort of previous frustrations, I guess, with politics in Kent. It's doing very well. It's winning awards year after year to the point where it must be quite boring at this stage, just kind of winning everything all the time. But, well done. And now that you are the sort of the Stephen Hendry of local political reporting, what do you... Well, I do love to get a snooker reference in.
That was not a comparison I was expecting, sorry.
But now that it's been very successful, it's a model we've seen other parts of the UK follow. Why do you think it's so difficult for mainstream media to cover local politics as well? If I look at, say, the BBC's local democracy service, I would say nowhere near the same standard, however much they're kind of putting into it, which is a lot of money. And again, on my own Substack, when I've been looking for stories in the local area, there's this incredible sort of rich seam of mad stuff going on almost everywhere that you can dig into and mine and find incredible stories. Why do you think you've been able to do it, but perhaps more traditional outlets haven't?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think on the most part, it there's an element of resources, and we certainly don't have resources, but also we're seemingly willing to sit in council meetings for hours at our own expense to get this job done. And newspapers aren't necessarily willing to send a journalist to a council meeting for, say, 5-6 hours in the hope that a small story might come out of it. Whereas we feel it's just important someone is sitting in the room for each of those meetings, regardless of whether or not anything comes out of it. Now, that might be, I mean, from our point of view, good journalism, but it's also ultimately a terrible business model. So I see why other people don't necessarily want to go down that path. The local democracy reporting service, that's a slightly more complicated question. I think they are doing good work with what they've got, but also it is still relatively limited. We've got ultimately 3 local democracy reporters in Kent. We've got one covering Medway, one covering Kent County Council, and then another one who has to cover all 13 districts in Kent at once. Now, so that means ultimately, like, Kent County Council and Medway Council do get reasonable coverage, but you're not getting much in the way of coverage of what's happening at, say, Thanet District Council, or what's happening down in Sevenoaks or Ashford. And that's kind of the gap in the coverage. And that's something we wrestle with as well, because we're ultimately a 2-person operation, and covering, effectively 13, 14 councils is slightly beyond our time and resources, unfortunately.
So Ed, you're doing amazing work. I do recommend everyone listening, go now, subscribe to Kent Current, subscribe to Local Authority. Even if you don't live in Kent, if you're interested in what Reform are doing when they're actually trying to govern somewhere, trying to actually run somewhere, support Ed and his colleague Steve and their amazing work. We'll put links to all of that on abundancepod.com. But for now, Ed Jennings, thank you very much.